is knowledge and why is it important? Well, let's consider either yourself or an organization or a team. You can scale it to a certain extent. And I'll ask the question, what completely determines the performance of yourself or the organization every day? What single thing completely determines the performance level of your own work or your organization's work? And that's a rhetorical question. I will answer it for you, if you will. And I will say it is the actions you take that day, or it's the actions that every employee of your organization take that day. And those actions completely determine the performance of your organization that day.
David, I have your chart behind you, just so you know.
You have what? Oh, okay. Good, thanks. Think about that a minute. The actions you take completely determine the performance you do that day. You can think all you want to, and that's wonderful and useful, but it doesn't change one thing in the physical world. Nothing. Now, talking is an action. Listening is an action, etc.
Except of course your brain, which will remain. Thought does change your brain. Just want to point that out.
Okay, now, if that's the case, if you look up here at the view graph, if you want high performance, then you need to take the right actions. What determines that? Well, first of all, you have to want to. And that's a management and leadership responsibility, and a very important one. Because if they don't do their job, you don't want to work with that organization. You don't want to do it, but you're there and you're going to do what you want to. The second one is, are you empowered to take actions? Many, many people are not. For various reasons, some good, some bad. But you have to be empowered. But what's the third thing? Do you know what actions to take? Do you understand what actions to take? But there you've got to understand the vision and the mission of the organization, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, the knowledge that you have will determine the actions you take. Now, we have defined knowledge in a very specific way, which you will hear a number of times, and a lot of other people have too. No misunderstanding. We actually did it for the Navy 15 years ago, and they bought onto it, and the military can understand it easily. The capacity to take effective action in varied and uncertain circumstances. The capacity to take effective action. By that I mean take the actions that lead to the outcome that you want. If you can do that, you have essentially perfect knowledge of that particular situation. Because you know what to do. You thought about it. If I do this and this and this, I'll get that and that. And if you're right, we say you have knowledge of that particular situation at that time. Capacity to take effective action. We put varied and uncertain circumstances on it because we don't want to fight with the computer people who say, my computer has knowledge, which is wrong to begin with. But that's not the point. They sell it with knowledge and so forth. No computer can handle varied and uncertain circumstances. You typically handle several million different scenarios in your world every day without even knowing it. That's different between the human mind and a computer. I'm not saying in 20 years the computers and the human minds, when they meld, we don't know what we're going to get, and it may well be that, okay, now they are not. So make sure you separate that, and we will give you a good definition of information so you know the difference. Because again, if we don't have precise interpretations, we can't communicate very effectively. You can choose almost any definition within reason for something, but if others don't know it, you can't communicate because you don't know what the word means. So when we say knowledge, we mean the capacity to take effective action in varied and uncertain circumstances.
Now the word capacity, just let's get on common ground here, means both potential and actual. So you may be pulling that information in for future use as knowledge. Okay? So it's both potential and actual.
So you need to know how to do it. You have knowledge of how to do something right to get the expected results, and you need to be able to do it. But somebody else may do it, and you know how. If they can do it because you've told them, here's exactly what you do, go talk to Jane, explain this and this and this and this, we get it settled, that's okay too. You see that the capacity means both, if you look it up in the dictionary. Potential and actual capability. Part of it. Okay, what's next? You can use knowledge to create ideas, make decisions, or solve problems. And of course, to take action. Now, this right here is the decision strategy, if you will. You may need creativity to come up with new ideas, how to solve the problem, how to implement the problem, etc. You have to solve the problem itself. You have to make decisions if you have several solutions. And you have to implement that decision by effective action. But at the core of all of this is knowledge. Now, we've defined it, but we haven't talked about its characteristics and so forth. We're going to do a little bit of that too, so you get a much better feel for it. And I know this is not simple, and I apologize for that. And if it can be made simpler, we'd love to do it. We also have about 35 journal articles we've written in this area, and we'll be happy to give you copies of them if you want. Learning is the creation of knowledge.
Well, as we go through the next couple of hours, since we're going to be intimately interconnected, if you have a card, or if not, on a little piece of paper, put your email and your name, and on the back, any subject that hits you that we talk about, we have a paper one, we will email that to you. So all I have to do is just start creating a list, and I will put those in the email for you. So
Learning.
just put knowledge, we'll put everything we have about knowledge, okay?
We consider learning to be predominantly the creation of knowledge. Now, what is knowledge? Well, I'll give you 6 words which are good attributes of it, if you will. But I won't expect you to remember it, but we'll come back to them sometime. It's not just being aware of something. It's understanding. It's seeing the meaning in it. It's having an insight about something, a problem, a situation, or so forth. It's having an intuitive feel about it, perhaps. It's being able to create new ideas when you see this problem or situation, and so forth. It's being able to make judgments about it. And of course, it's being able to anticipate the outcome. Now, that's very different from information. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Next one, Helen. This is a feedback loop, of course, because, as I said, we learn predominantly through experience. There are other technical words for how you learn, and that they're legitimate too. But basically, once you see the performance, then you go back and compare what happened to what you expected to happen, and that difference is a learning potential. Why did it happen this way instead of that way? That way you learn more about that situation. And of course, that's positive. The negative side is, as Alex mentioned, that knowledge is context sensitive and situational dependent. So every time you have a different situation, you will need a little slightly different amount of knowledge depending on the situation. Because the situations do not repeat very often. Sometimes they do. And that depends on whether we're talking about a complex situation or a complicated situation. We'll get into that a little bit later. Any questions?
Up until now, you have not mentioned truth in relation to knowledge.
Truth.
Which is a more classical epistemological definition. Does truth have any relationship to knowledge?
That's an interesting question, Michael.
Yes.
Only in the sense, do we know what truth is? Can we verify and validate truth? Or is it a common assumption or a real?
Okay.
And that gets back into the philosophical aspects of it.
Michael's going back to the philosophical justified true belief as the definition of knowledge. And in just a moment, we're going to actually bring that in.
Indirectly, yeah.
Indirectly. And we'll now be a little bit more directly because of the question. So we'll tie that in a little bit.
I have a question. In some schools of thought that are too dissimilar to the common belief, there's a notion of tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge.
Yes.
Where tacit is what you have internally, and that feedback loop certainly fuels that. But the explicit knowledge is the knowledge that is captured in a lot of the repositories,
Okay, now-
if you will.
I like that.
You want to answer it, all
Yeah.
right.
Did you finish your question? I want to do that.
Well, I mean, I can understand that you're talking about tacit knowledge here, and that
But not only.
particular school of thought.
Go ahead.
Let me clarify that just a little bit, and I want to hone in your understanding just a hair for that. A really good point to bring up. The term tacit does not imply you have knowledge within. It implies, it refers to those things which you cannot, that knowledge which you cannot pull up and share with others. It's tacit, so it's held within. It's the inability to share it. So it doesn't refer to a particular type of knowledge in terms of a taxonomy of knowledges. It refers to the inability of things that, your inability of things for any learner, things you've learned and things you know and things that have become very deep within, and the inability to express it easily and to share that. That's the tacit concept. Explicit means to be made visible, right? That which can be made visible. So the concept of explicit actually puts things right out. It is the stuff you can capture in your database, you can write in a book that's in your document here. And we're going to talk a little bit about another way to maybe think about this. Those are very useful terms. And we actually add a third term to that. We talk about the term implicit. And we see this as a variable because the mind is associative. You may have things that today are tacit, and yet tomorrow something may happen in a critical situation that associates with it and triggers a memory, and you have the ability to say a one-liner that is, extremely easy to understand by your colleagues who already all have perhaps the same background as you. So tacit is not necessarily tacit in terms of it's a shifting boundary. Okay, so we call that implicit stuff that sort of shifts back and forth. That can go either way. It can be tacit or it can shift up and be made explicit at another time when it's triggered. Okay, so tacit isn't an absolute. Does that make sense?
A couple of years ago, I encountered a company in the Netherlands called Be Informed. And their paradigm was called separate the know from the flow. And they're doing a lot of work for the Dutch government with knowledge management. And the idea was that a lot of the very useful knowledge is buried in the flow of what an organization does.
Yes.
Email messages, the spreadsheets, all that stuff. So I started to follow that idea of pulling everything out that was really important from the flow of daily work and compiling that. And I don't know whether that's part of separating tacit from, but
Well, yeah.
to me
it's
that's a
good
very
point.
important concept for my own knowledge management, is namely pulling out the nuggets of knowledge from the flow, which is a lot of things that come across our desktop and the internet that literally get in the way of where all that is.
Yeah, and that's basically the explicit knowledge, because you can see it. You can see the flow, you see the motion, see the actions they take, and you can ask them why they took it. So,
There's another way to look at it. I forget who it was. It's somebody that wrote this down. Is the fact is expressed. That means it's actually been put down on paper and you can understand it. Expressible means you can, but it hasn't been done. And unexpressible.
yes. Tacit basically means it's in your unconscious mind. You can make decisions because it's based on intuition or gut feel. It's not based on logic. If it's logic, you know what the answer is, and that's the explicit knowledge.
So if you want to have the paper that deals with this, it's embedding tacit knowledge. And we talk about 4 kinds of tacit things that are tacit within us and refer to them in this way. By the way, everything, any models we share, any ways of thinking are from years and years of our thought, and they're not the only way to think. There's many ways to think. What is the advantage of